All right, we're live. Thanks everyone for joining today. Appreciate that. We're here with Brad Hargreaves from ThesisDriven. ThesisDriven is a media company focused on the built world. I don't know if anybody subscribed to his newsletter. It's super interesting, both from a prop tech perspective. I know from a CEO side of things, I get a ton of value out of it. In addition to just insights on the on what's going on in the built world, and not just for multifamily specifically. I think you wrote an article this week about home building, just like a lot of the news that's topical and relevant. I do recommend everyone listens to it or takes a read through it. Talking about getting to hell yes with Brad today. Another thing that Brad does, and we're in this program as well, looking forward to kicking off, is he helps prop tech founders re-articulate their value proposition so they can get to hell yes with real estate owners and managers and people within this vertical. So we had a chance to connect with Brad and offer to get on the show. And the point, one of the exciting things about Brad is that not only does he coach people on how to become better sellers in the world of real estate or the built world, but in addition, he's also got his own company that he's selling. So there's two different angles of the conversation to have. And like everything we talk about getting to hell yes, it's about trying to find the conversations that drive faster sales and orient themselves around problem solving versus solution pitching. And a big thing that those of us that sell into property management and also real estate suffer from is that there's a lot of dynamics. Well, for as many similarities as there are, there's differences between every single prospect and target that you're talking to. And so that makes it a little bit, I don't know, that creates the opportunity for customized and personalized conversations. So without further ado, Brad, if you tell us a little bit about yourself and what's the problem you guys solve at ThesisDriven.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me on the show today. Really excited to be here. So just a bit about myself. I'm an entrepreneur. I've been starting companies my whole life. I've built two companies at the intersection of tech and real estate. The first was more on the education side. We built a company called General Assembly, which became the largest trade school in the US teaching tech and design skills. Sold that in 2018. Then got more involved on the real estate side. So built a multifamily operating platform called Common, which was focused on innovative typologies like co-living, micro apartments, live workspaces that a lot of traditional managers struggled with. Sold that in 22. Said, what do I do? Started writing. Built this newsletter called ThesisDriven. Said, okay, twice a week, I'm going to write something about an innovative concept. Could be a new technology, could be a societal trend, could be a macroeconomic thing, could be a new financial innovation that's really driving the future of the built world. It was tailored initially toward developers and investors, but we've since really expanded the scope. And at this point, we have tens of thousands of subscribers from people all across the built world, interested in policy, interested in technology, interested in what's going to come of cities, urbanism, suburbs, etc. So we have a great audience, and over the past year, we've launched a couple of businesses that really serve that audience based on needs that we saw. And one which you're in is our Selling into Real Estate Owners program, because we saw a big need for many people in the prop tech ecosystem to level up how they're selling into the real estate industry. So it kind of taps into 15 years of learnings I had selling into commercial owners, multifamily owners, property managers, asset managers, kind of the whole gamut. And I like to say it's not a sell me this pen kind of sales course. I'm not that kind of coach. It's really to fundamentally understand the problem that you're solving, that your customer has, put it in the vernacular, the language that your customer knows, and then be able to drive a lot of leads in the top of the funnel. And so you get as many shots on goal as possible. So that's the program. We have 5 different programs, but they're all really serving people in the real estate and prop tech ecosystems.
What do you call that course?
Yeah, that course is called Selling into Real Estate Owners. But we have 5 different programs. Okay. Yeah, we have some focused on capital raising, and intro to development. Those are more tailored to people who want to become real estate developers. And then we have a few programs a little
Hmm.
more focused on the prop tech, the operating, the vendor side. We have our selling into real estate owners program, and then we have one called Fundamentals of Commercial Real Estate, which is more intro real estate 101, real estate finance for people, newcomers to the industry who don't have that background, don't know what a GPLP structure is, don't know what a waterfall is,
Right.
don't understand how debt terms work, but that would be beneficial to what they're doing.
Very cool. So when you take a look at kind of going back to the common conversation, the common experience, um, like you guys built something for a specific subclass within a subclass.
Yeah.
And how did you find the problems that needed to be solved there? Like what was your did you have a personal experience with that, or did that just become obvious, or how did that
Well,
pop
actually
up as something to solve?
kind of originated out of General Assembly. I mean, we had so many on the customer side. We had so many students that really struggled to find a place to live.
Hmm.
And we found many of them when they moved to a place like New York, DC, San Francisco, which is where our locations were. They wouldn't even look for an apartment, they would look for a room on Craigslist. And
Hmm.
on the flip side, you had owners that were always looking for more opportunities to drive NOI, drive
Hmm.
higher revenue from their properties. So we kind of put and two together and said, hey, there's this opportunity to create new types of housing that is higher NOI because you're increasing density, but has a lower sticker price and is a more managed roommate situation. So that became co-living. It became very popular, and of from the 2015 2021, around the time we sold perspective,
Hmm.
and we became the largest operator of that type of housing in the US.
It's interesting, like the co-living conversation, just even like last night. So I'm here at the Happy Summit.
Yeah.
And you inevitably you end up around the bar at the end on day one or day two or day three. And and we were chatting last night about co-living and the arrangements that are happening within co-living and co-living insurance, and how that's all coming up. It's uh I had not been too exposed to that, the problems that exist within co-living, and then the ramifications that trickled into all different kinds of products. I mean, my life growing up with a roommate, it was like, don't drink my milk. It wasn't, I'm gonna insure my stuff independent of you're insuring your stuff. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? And that was kind of like, so it was insightful. Um, like when you're getting at that, going to that market, like the common side of things, how did you find buyers?
On the real estate side, or on the, because
Well,
we were
well,
kind
actually,
of
better
double
question.
sided in
Better.
that.
Okay, that's a better question. Who was your buyer?
So we had consumers
Yeah,
who needed a place to live. Frankly, we
yeah,
did not think as much about them. Not that we didn't care about the product, but there was so much demand for housing in these cities that the
right.
real bottleneck to our growth was selling into owners, selling into developers. And that was the much more complicated, nuanced, and I would say tougher sale, is
Hmm.
how do you get a developer that's been doing things the same way for 30 years to suddenly do things differently and build 3, 4, 5 bedroom apartments
Hmm.
designed with roommates in mind? That's a real challenge, and you have to hit that on multiple levels. You have to think about, okay, making the financial case, which
Hmm.
is pretty clear. You're generating higher NOI per square foot. You're generating, you're not raising construction costs very much. So if anything, you're decreasing them in a lot of ways because
Hmm.
you're building fewer kitchens per square foot. So you can make
Okay.
the financial case. That's actually pretty straightforward. The challenge is
And
all
it
the
follows the heads and beds model, right? Like
heads
you
and
just
debts.
put
That's
more
what it is.
heads and beds, right?
Right. So the challenge is really, how do you overcome some of the veto holders that are in the process? So
Yeah.
often investors, their LPs are like, we've been generating great return just doing traditional multifamily. I know we're not blowing the doors off. Let's just keep doing that. Then obviously the lender is a big issue. So
Hmm.
a lot of what we think about in the course is, how do you identify veto holders and kind of proactively
Hmm.
work to design and this goes all the way back to product design. There's a
Hmm.
lot of what we would say is like, hey, here's the feedback our sales team is getting. How do we create different variations of the product that
Hmm.
are actually going to overcome these objections? So let's go back and say, okay, maybe we're going to blend some studios in with our 4-bedroom apartments, create kind of a mixed environment. That still generates a much higher NOI, but it's less weird. It's less atypical. It's going to be less objectionable to a lender. Okay,
Hmm.
let's look at our sales motion in terms of who are we going out to? Are these, and how are we pitching this? Is it one site that is entirely co-living, or are we taking over a few floors or a wing or something like that? So creating that optionality for the sales team, starting with the product,
Hmm.
was really key, and then arming the sales team with data
Hmm.
on how have these things performed historically. What is the demand we're seeing in your market? So not just nationally, but
Hmm.
if we're selling in LA, what demand are we seeing in LA? What demand are we seeing in Chicago? What demand are we seeing in Miami? Understanding that and making it hyper local, really key.
So then, why would a lender object to an innovation that could drive a higher NOI?
Well, lenders don't get paid based on NOI. They're the
Okay.
first money out, so they have unlimited downside but
Hmm.
limited upside. So if the developer comes to them and says, "Hey, we're going to generate higher NOI," that doesn't make it into the lender's pocket. The worst that can happen is, they have a building that, is weird, and then
Hmm.
something goes wrong, and the lender doesn't know what to do with it. The lender has
Hmm.
to take over the property. If it's traditional multifamily, they have their favored manager they can go hand it to, and they
Got it.
they can underwrite that, and they know what's going to happen. This is
Right.
more risk. It's weird. I mean, lenders, I don't want to denigrate lenders, but like many of them are box checkers. They're much more conservative than your developers out there. They're smart
Hmm.
people, but they're way more conservative, and that's structural. That's the incentives. They don't get paid based on the upside. So it's overcoming those objections can be a real challenge.
So then, if we kind of follow the money and go from the lender to the owner, and this maybe will help us kind of move into the thesis-driven conversation. When you're talking about from the lender to the owner, when the owner is out there trying to prioritize and solve problems, how can we as sellers best target? I'm going to frame this carefully: the people that are accountable for action. And with respect to the owner category and then the manager category, and of course there's the joint of the owner manager, but like, how can we as sellers make sure that we're solving the problem for the right person
Yeah,
and carve that up?
it's real challenge. So the first challenge is just knowing who the right person is,
Hmm.
and identifying that, often the right person that you're solving a problem for might be different than the decision maker too, which is where
Yep.
you can have real challenges. So that's kind of where we get into champion led sales of like, okay, your
Hmm.
VP of asset management or your local asset manager might be your champion. They might be excited about what you're selling, what you're offering. They're the one that has the problem you're solving. But then the VP of asset management, the principal, the managing director in charge of the firm, they're the one that's the real decision maker for that budget or that risk or what have you. So
Yeah.
then it's about, identifying the champion, winning them over, and then arming them with the data, the sales, basically deputizing them as a salesperson, if you will,
Yeah.
and giving them all the ammo they need to win over the decision maker too. Which, it's two
Like one of
steps
the
down.
things, like one of the things that we struggle with, I said as founders, is we tend to overcomplicate our sales messages, right? And so your whole point on deputizing an internal salesperson is often lost as we overcomplicate the message, the value driven. Maybe we put in too many value points, right? Hey, we can solve all these 10 things for you. You should buy now, right? Versus making it a single value proposition and allowing that to expand over the course of the commercial relationship as you kind of
Right.
begin to understand what priorities they're trying to solve. We've done that probably for 2 years we did that. And like trying to learn like what is the single problem they're trying to solve. And what I've found is that the only real way to find, and don't get me wrong, You can research, you can GPT, you can do all these things. But the only real way to find out what is, or sorry, how do I frame this without kind of like forcing the answer? How do you, I found that the best way to find out what is the priority of people is to talk to people. Is
Yes.
there another way, or is there a faster way, a better way? Is there a hack?
No, you got to talk to them at the end of the day. There's not
Yeah.
a I don't know if I don't think there's a hack out there other than just getting in and understanding your people. I mean, there's frameworks you can use as you get more scale to make that easier. So the first thing we do in our sales course is selling into real estate owners is we talk about user and buyer personas. So,
Mhm,
it's often the case that a company does not just have one buyer persona, but they have a few of them. And you can talk about like, oh, this client, they're a Kathy. And here's who Kathy is. And Kathy wants, she really cares about NOI.
mhm,
She's maybe a little more risk averse. Maybe she, and you could go deep and say, like, here are the social media that, Kathy reads, and here's the trade
mhm,
publication she reads, and here's the events she goes to. And so you're building that user, that buyer persona. And you obviously have to talk to a lot of Kathys to build that persona of Kathy. But once you do, it can be a really useful mechanism
mhm.
for having that common vernacular across the sales
But
team.
isn't that, and but that persona of Kathy, like this is the mistake we made in the past, is you built this persona of Kathy based on research or maybe hunches, and you think that that's, or we have thought that's the target, right? When in fact, our persona of Kathy was actually, well, I'll look at my experience, better framed as a hunch. We have a hunch that
Right.
this is our persona as a buyer, and then we can filter on that. And then the job is to go out there and test against
Correct.
that hunch and see what if that's correct. Because the mistake that we made in the past was that this is Kathy, and then we would go tell people who are like Kathy that they should be like Kathy. And why don't you think like Kathy?
Right. Exactly.
Versus asking them, are you like Kathy? Do you find yourself similar to Kathy? Do you suffer from the same problems that Kathy's suffering through? And like one of the things that constantly iterating towards, and this kind of came from working with Rob Snyder. I don't know if you've met him, but you guys certainly are aligned. Is this whole discovery process of getting them to talk
Yeah.
and getting them to share their stories, and
Yeah.
like even going as far as like instead of saying, "Hi, do you have a problem with maintenance?" Like one of our
Right.
conversations, it's like, tell me about your maintenance story. Can you tell me a story about that? Tell me a narrative that you felt. Tell me some pain that you are suffering from. And then have them explain that in a narrative. Oh, this one time we sent this, and this one time we did that, and then we discovered this. And those are the nuggets that begin to frame that persona. Because,
Yep.
like, if you look at kind of conventional market classes, you build your ICP and your persona, and then you kind of put it away. But it's
Right.
actually kind of, or at least our experience has been, you're actually always trying to work on that, and you almost want to go and disprove it. Like
Yeah.
we actually went on I did one of our outbound campaigns was like, hey, Brad, I see you're director of maintenance. Given your experience, we'd like to get your feedback on telemaintenance for multifamily. Um, this is probably a new idea for you. I'd love to hear why you think it won't work.
Yeah.
And people are
Totally.
like, oh,
I love
I'll
that.
tell you why it won't work. Right. And we got a high response rate, right? And so now we're not even there's like I'm actually giving them the no, and these are kind of those things that you get in sales where you kind of get to a point of desperation. They're a little bit different just to get that confirmation.
Yeah. Yeah. I think there's like if you challenge people a little bit and throw them something, a little bit of a curveball that they're not expecting, you get a really high response rate. You can get some really interesting answers and start some conversations. It's all about getting to that conversation. And I think the personas have to be a living document. Like this can't
Mhm.
be like something that sits on a shelf somewhere and like it's the same 2 years later as when you started. It's got to evolve, and it's got to really inform and get baked into your sales training. Once you have a sales team, those are really useful
Mhm.
tools for helping them understand who are they talking to, what are the kind of questions that we need to ask to identify those personas and know who I'm talking to. But yeah, early stage, should be a constant interrogation of
Yeah.
the person.
When you're of the person, yeah. And when you're doing the I would say of the persona, right? Not of the
Yeah,
people that you're
persona.
talking
Yeah,
to.
it's not, you're not
Yeah.
interrogating, you're the wrong word.
Yeah, the prospect. No, I get it. You want to like disprove it. Like it's
Yes.
it's a scientific method of disproving your hypothesis A and seeking results based on, or dependent variables of the outcome. And that was lost in the kind of like conventional go-to-market training, like the um what the heck's that book? Um, I can't remember. Anyway, but like the whole convention of the top of the funnel model assumes that you have your persona baked at the very top of funnel, and then you're going to go and just repeat, 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 repeat.
Right.
Whereas it's just not like that anymore, especially when buyers have so much information. So when you talk about what you're talking about, is what prompted you to create this selling an owner's course?
Yeah, it really came from just seeing a lot of prop tech companies out there. I mean, I'm probably out there talking to two or three prop tech companies a day and just seeing the
Hmm.
challenges they faced. And I've seen this pattern so many times of
Hmm.
you've got new technology, super interesting. You think it's going to resonate in the market. And the first place you go in the market is you go to the big real estate tech conferences. You go to Redcon, you go to Blueprint, you meet the big REITs, you meet some of the big allocators. They have a chief of innovation, they have a chief digital officer, head of technology, whatever. And so they make themselves known and they get themselves out there, but they can be challenging clients. Like they'll drag out a pilot for a long time. They have people there that are kind of dedicated to making reports and they'll take up a ton of your time and they may never pay you a dollar.
Hmm.
Whereas the great client might be someone with 10,000 apartment units in Ohio who's
Yeah.
never been to any of these conferences, who doesn't have a head of digital, who doesn't have a chief technology officer. The managing director, the owner of the business is the one making technology decisions, maybe informed by his VP of asset management, but
Hmm.
it's not, they're not going to trade shows. So we started this of just saying, how do we help these prop tech companies sell into that client, which is in many
Hmm.
ways going to be a better client than who they've been selling into. And there's a couple of pieces
Yes.
that, how do you reach that person? Because they're not always easy to reach. But then once you do reach that person, there's no translator there. Like those chief innovation officers, they act as a translator of,
Oh
they
yeah, I
take
love that.
in kind of the tech company speak and they can go to the managing director and say, hey, here's what this is, here's how it might impact our business.
Mhm.
Like you're selling to a middle market owner or developer, there's no translator, you have to speak the language.
Yeah.
So it's a big piece of this is just like, how do you speak the language? And then so we do kind of the first half of the course is all on that. It's on like the real estate
Hmm.
industry and speaking real estate language. And then second
Yep.
half of the course is all on lead generation, funnel thinking. How do you reach these people?
It's interesting, like prop tech, what I've observed from a prop tech perspective, and this is probably a natural thing, is that a lot of the new ideas are coming from outside the industry. I'm not from property management. I've never managed
Right.
a property in my life, but I did a ton. I did 20 plus years of maintenance centralization for industry, right? So for me, it's very easy to port over my experience and kind of like see the problems that I choose to recognize in property management, but I'm
Yeah.
unable to. It's there's a translation that I have to do in my head to speak to them, and sometimes I don't know the words that they're using, and it can even differ, like we said earlier, from owners and operators. They'll speak different
Right.
languages, and even parts of the geographically they have to speak different languages,
Correct. And
right?
different
And so
asset
like
classes,
understanding, yeah,
different asset
totally.
classes within real estate speak different languages. I mean, you talk to a big office owner, they're going to name things differently in many cases than like a Sunbelt multifamily developer. And just and we try to teach this as much as possible. Like a lot of these financial terms, there's a lot of overlap between them. So someone who's talking about, you know, return on cost, like cash on cash yield, unlevered yield on cost, those are all very related terms. And we can get into the nuances of how they might differ, but that from a tech sales perspective, you just mostly have to know they're all kind of the same thing, and that's what they're talking about. So
Yeah,
there
because we can't
is
create 100 decks. We've got to get good at one
right,
deck or maybe two decks. And then because we've got to navigate the nuances of the conversations or the offshoots of each conversation and what the point is in every single slide. For
yep,
a while there, like in our company, we were creating a new deck for every single customer, right? Which is exhausting. And we were also way all over the place in terms of like who our ICP was. We had such a high level ICP, it was like people that are breathing. That was kind of
yeah,
like the extent of it. Right. And so
totally,
like we couldn't really filter on that on Zoom info or on sales nav to find the people to talk to because it was everybody. And that was a real that there's a high cost of effort in terms of even the top of funnel sales motion. And we had no repeatability. So we didn't get known for anything.
right,
We've changed that. We're focusing on a single market. And even as we peel back the market, we find that there's the sub verticals have their own issues. Like I'm just even an easy like build to rent versus single family rental, right? A lot of people want to try and lump those into a single vertical, but they have two very different problems. One scattered
very different,
site, one's horizontal apartments, right?
right,
And like, I'll say BTR is kind of closer to garden style with respect to the challenges they face. Low density, 16 units per property, maybe 100, maybe even better than some low density garden style, right? And so, but people tend to want to classify them as one or the other. And so when we go to sell, they may even identify
yeah,
as one or the other. And then we try and go and sell into them. And it's like, oh no, they suffer from a different problem. And so
right.
you end up having like we have like kind of like offshoots in the single same sales deck as they begin to share with us how they identify themselves. Then we go and say, okay, well, this is for a different, sub vertical. Let's move into this vertical here and have that conversation.
I mean, one of my favorite examples there is just that so many prop tech founders, sales leaders don't understand is the difference between build to hold versus build to sell. Different
Yeah.
strategies that developers take. If you're selling into a merchant builder, that's a very different process. It may not even be a qualified lead, depending on
Mhm.
what you're selling, if they're taking the building to market as soon as it's stabilized, versus a long-term holder, a core investor. That's a totally different thing. The asset might be identical. The building
Mhm.
might look exactly the same, but based on the business plan of the owner, might have two totally different go-to-markets. So
And
it
I'm going to guess that people would also learn that they have totally different banking covenants and banking arrangements.
yes,
And so like that is often where the buck does stop. And one of the things that we talk about in this show all the time is the time wall. And something that I've come to observe, and it's hard to find, is that a time wall emerges when a refi begins to happen or is in the forecast for an owner. And I'm learning, and this is kind of in real time, that like the owner's influence in property operations begins to crescendo as you approach that refi. Because all
hmm
of a sudden the data really matters. And if the
right,
refi has already happened, then they can kind of like coast for a bit because they've got a couple of years before they got to do something. And those external forces create that time wall that otherwise didn't exist. And I find it interesting, on our side, as we kind of double click on some of those questions, and it can appear to be a little bit intrusive to begin to ask those, especially if you're maybe talking to someone who's an owner operator and they don't want to disclose. But it does show that you understand their business and what motivates them, and that you've had a few sales cycles under your belt that you can go and say, well, I know this really matters to you. Do you have a refi coming, or what's vacancy like? And then you can get them really kind of talking to you um, about the things we need to solve.
Yeah. No, that at least showing that you know the terminology and that you
Yeah,
understand their business that is so key. It's part of the empathy, and I believe empathy is a big part of the sales
yeah.
process, is understanding the challenges that they're facing and what they're seeing in their business. And so understanding what they're, where are they in their lending cycle? That's a key factor. You know, Another big time wall is the annual budget, like understanding kind of how they do their budgeting process.
Hmm.
Is another as well. I mean, you hear about budgeting a lot in other industries and other sectors, like how to make it into the budget. Well, the same thing happens,
Hmm.
particularly with third party managed buildings. That property manager, August through October, is often doing the budget
Yeah.
and making it in for there and being able to be a part of that conversation, depending on what you're selling, can be key.
I find it interesting to have that in the budget conversation, is that the budget, like at the top down budget and then the bottom up budget, when it comes to operating that budget, often have collisions. And those are good points to pull on, because if it's a manager, they've signaled this budget to the owner, and the owner may have signaled that to their banker. And so that's kind of like locked in. But then all of the calamity that happens underneath that budget line of how actually, shit gets done, that's where the opportunity is from a conversation perspective, because the constraints of a budget means you're kind of locked into this box from a financial perspective, but it's kind of like loaded with assumptions that may or may not be true when it comes to actual execution.
Totally, because there's going to be some fudge in terms of, what is our technology expense, what is our turnover cost, what is our marketing spend. Like there's a lot of, kind of fudge numbers in there, and what they need to do at the end of the day, from an owner's perspective, is they need to stay current with their loan covenants. So
Mhm.
not get below a certain debt service coverage ratio, might be you know other requirements around financial performance. Obviously, with a long-term owner, they're probably more worried about how much cash is this throwing off.
Mhm.
But that's conversation between the manager and the owner, and understanding
Mhm.
that relationship is key.
So when you're coaching prop tech companies about to find the hell yes buyers, what I mean, yeah, I'll back it up a little bit. Like we talked a little bit of this offline around like revenue side sales versus cost side, sorry, revenue side solutions versus cost side solutions. Like on the revenue side, the hell yes often driven by a time wall that exists from a quarter perspective. Like this could be, or maybe it's a lease up. These things are kind of like they're time bound from a revenue perspective. On the cost side, like the time is a bit mushier. How do how do people, or what have you seen in terms of trying to elevate that cost or that time wall for cost saving type solutions? Because we're kind of heading into this. Why I'm framing it that way is it feels like, and correct me because you have more data on this than I do. I choose to read the data that I want to read. You read it all. It's like it feels like we're heading into an operational excellence cycle in
Yeah,
in real estate, right? In property management. And that feels different than so I'll split that into, it feels like we're moving into a price taking environment versus a price making environment. And price takers are forced into operational excellence disciplines, versus price makers don't necessarily have to be as around operational excellence. They should be about increasing pricing, grabbing revenue, et cetera. So as we move into this, if you do or don't agree with that, how do we create time walls for our prospects or our buyers, or how do we discover time walls
yeah.
in our prospects when it comes to
Yes.
cost saving solutions?
Totally. And my view on this is we have been in this frame of cost saving and operational excellence taking top billing for more than 12 months now. And I think that's going to
Agreed.
continue. But like you look at, we do this thing on our newsletter where every quarter we read the call transcripts of all of the
Mhm.
big REITs because they do their earnings calls and they talk
Yeah.
about what are they
Yep.
doing, what are they focused on. And they don't say everything, but it's a little
Mhm.
lens into what are the biggest real estate owners concerned with, what are they focused on, what are they excited about. And we've been doing this for about 2 years, and one big shift you've seen over the past 2 years is way less focus on top line revenue generation. Remember 2 years
Mhm.
ago, everyone was talking about we're going to put these IoT devices on the wall, and people are going to pay more rent because they have a smart thermostat. I mean, that was 2-3 years ago
Yeah.
for a lot of these REITs, and now it's all about centralization, back office automation. We're going to use AI. We're going to do this stuff faster. We're going to do better fraud detection, all this stuff.
Mhm.
So, getting to your question, time walls are a lot tougher when it comes to cost savings. Hitting a budget cycle, that's one. Understanding what their business plan is. So it's not so
Mhm.
much creating time walls as like discovering what's there today. Like, are they going to take the building to market at some point? Do they have a refi coming up, which we talked about earlier? So understanding kind of what those natural time walls are. Because if you're talking about some like piece of software that's going to fundamentally change their building's operations, they're probably not going to respond that well to external pressure to buy on a certain timeline.
Mhm.
Like they're not like expiring discounts, like all that stuff works in consumer. That's not going to work here. So it's more about discovering what
Yeah.
time walls they have already versus, trying to create one yourself.
Well, this is the question that we kind of like to use is like what if you don't solve this problem? What's going to happen? Right.
Yeah.
What I found interesting, and I'd be curious to get, and maybe this is an opportunity for you to write an article on, is like the leading indicator of what the REITs are talking about in problems, and then put that against like conference attendant or conference vendor expos. Don Bedbridge did a really good piece of tech and kind of like he stratified all the different vendors types that were at OpTech. And like of all the things, I think it was just like there was like 5% of the vendors that were there were maintenance and operations.
Yeah.
Everybody else was like connected devices. There was obviously the PMSs were there, but like PMS is largely it's kind of a commoditized category. You got a whole bunch of maybe a quarter of them were leasing type related technology,
Managed
like
Wi-Fi.
connected device, managed
So much,
Wi-Fi, man.
so
Like
much money in managed Wi-Fi.
yeah, oh, it's because yeah, and so like I find it interesting to like take a look at what the REITs are talking about. And if you look at that article that Dom wrote, and look at how that's represented in terms of vendors, which is the who's paying to play, who's paying to sell, and I think they're disconnected.
Yeah.
Like I was pretty shocked walking up and down the aisles there, and kind of taking with kind of like insight into what Dom had written about, and kind of proving it to myself. And wow, it is true. Like everyone here is talking about leasing, managed Wi-Fi, connected, etc. But nobody's talking about what the REITs are talking about. And so I'll be curious to see how that transitions as we get into like an OpTech in November this year. Who's going to be represented? Because like if it's the same thing vendors trying to sell, like if you look at that, take it that as a representation of the problems that our people are buying, because that's kind of who's there at the show. And then you take what the REITs are talking about in terms of the problems in the market, those don't line up. And so there's opportunity, but it's also kind of an interesting observation that what's being sold isn't what's being thought, but what needs to be solved.
Right. Yeah. It's I mean, I personally think show attendance is a lagging indicator
Yeah.
of where buyers' heads are. Like,
Yeah.
the people who are buying big boosts at OpTech. I love OpTech, it's a great show. But the people who are buying big boosts there, they're companies that have done well over the past 2, 3, 4 years, and therefore have, had big 2024 marketing budgets. So I see
Mhm.
that as a lagging indicator of where the world is going. And I mean, if you were to go into, the funny thing they did at Optech is they had, the big show floor downstairs, which was,
Hmm.
all of your, big spenders. And then they had
Yeah.
this little startup show floor upstairs.
Yeah.
Frankly,
Yeah.
like a lot of the more interesting companies were up there. It was sad. I mean, it was a sad windowless space. Like,
Yeah.
none of the snacks, none of the drinks were up in the startup space. Uh, you know,
And you had to trip on it.
what was that?
You had to trip on it. Like it wasn't
Yeah,
easy
you
to
had to.
find.
Yeah, it was not easy to find, but then some of the more interesting companies were up there. Companies doing like cool data analytics stuff, centralization, AI. Like the interesting stuff was upstairs.
Hmm. Interesting. So kind of bringing me back to the hell yes side of things. So when we're talking out as a prop tech side of things, um, and seeking that hell yes buyer. So your comment on trying to find that time wall is something we need to let the customer has to reveal what their time wall is because it's going to be unique to them. Is that kind of your guidance on that?
That's my guidance on that. It's tough to do that artificially on the cost
And
savings side.
so, when we talk about like alternatives, so like prior to, considering a new way of doing things, there's often the alternatives conversation because like one of the things that we found is that like a hell yes buyer is someone who's like tried to seek out a solution. Like, oh, okay, well, why I'm joining the thesis course, right?
Yep.
Is that my why I'm a hell yes for you is because I have tried to do this myself.
Yeah.
And not that we've been pretty good at it, but we can be way better. And I
Yeah.
recognize that the gaps that I have, and if I can learn this faster, and I think of things in terms of the quarter, if I can learn how to rearticulate our value proposition to my prospect in under a quarter, I'm saving a quarter of burn, and hopefully, especially Q1, right?
Yeah.
And I can lay the groundwork for successful Q2. If I've got Q1, Q2 figured out, my year is good.
Yeah.
But
It's
if I'm lagging, if I'm talking to a wall in Q1 and then I'm just getting dead air in Q2, I'm toast in Q3.
it's an accelerant. That's what it is.
Mhm.
It's like, look, could you patch something like this together through a bunch of conversations with experts and YouTube videos and GPT searches and whatnot? Like maybe, but
Mhm.
we look at it as like here is the package for selling
Mhm.
into real estate owners.
Mhm.
And it's really about, knowing that you're approaching it with that confidence and that plan to articulate it in the right way, reach the right people, and then fill the top of the funnel, which is super important.
Mhm.
And then measure what you're doing
Um,
and think about it in terms of the
yeah,
funnel. I mean, it's remarkable the number of prop tech employees who don't think about it in terms of a funnel. Sales leaders, all the
really?
way up, starting with, of course, like at the bottom of the sales funnel, they do it from like lead to call to conversion. But I don't want to start with lead. I want to start with page view. I want to start with awareness. I want to start at the
Sure.
top of the funnel.
Right, right. Do you find that like that's just a mismatch with respect to things you need to learn when you're in a prop tech company? Like you just need to learn that, but maybe you might not know it ahead of time to
Well,
learn it?
so people come at prop tech from all different perspectives and all different angles. And like some of them
Mhm.
have a ton of sales experience. Like they're like, I know how to do
Mhm.
lead generation. I know how to sell, but they don't know real estate and they don't have the vernacular down. And that's in some ways like the easiest thing to solve. You just have to like
Mhm.
level up on kind of understanding the industry and the world you're in. And then you have people
Mhm.
who, are technical, man. They've built an incredible product. Maybe they understand a little bit about the real estate industry. They've done some customer interviews, but like can't get out of their own way on lead generation. They don't understand thinking about things in terms of the funnel. They don't think about sales at scale. So they're stuck
Mhm.
in pilot hell with like 3 or 4 REITs. And it's like, come on, you got to get out here, got to push this product out. So we encounter
Mhm.
both.
Well, and it can be interesting because you look at some of the success stories, like you dig in on funnel leasing, right? And like their success, and they're happy they talk about it all the time. that they started with the REITs. And so you'd be inclined to think, okay, if the REITs are the ones that are expressing their problems, then we should probably start with the REITs. But then you back it up and you go, well, wait a second. Like, these are publicly traded companies. They have they're going to have a buying committee. They're going to be there to try and, they may be more aware of the problem than anybody else, but they're kind of like, they have less power or less authority, less decision making authority or discretionary budget authority to be able to make a buy. So it's like, while they may have the problem, they express it. Maybe the rule of thumb is to listen to what the REITs are saying in terms of articulating a problem, and then go find a buyer who can buy, because it's not the REITs.
Yeah. And I don't think it's a bad idea to talk to them and have those
Yeah.
conversations and like build those relationships. But I remember at Common, we had our first conversation with Hines, which they're not a REIT, but they're a huge, one of the biggest developers in the US, in the world.
Mhm.
We had our first conversation in 2016, and we finally signed that deal with them in 2020. It's a
Wow.
four-year sales cycle. So it's going to take a while.
Yeah.
And they're a smart group. They're good people. But it takes a while to get the wheels going, especially if you have a more complicated product. There are plenty of like smaller emerging managers, private equity groups that acted way faster, that bought within 3, 6, 9 months.
So for those listening, we're talking about the hell yes buyer. The hell yes buyer needs to fall into it. I mean, they need to match your size, I guess, is kind of the lesson there. Like, if you're the biggest PMS in the world, then you could go match up with the biggest property manager in the world, and that's a good fit. But if you're an emerging prop tech company, then you got to think with, let's call it a scrappy prop tech company, then you got to find the scrappy owner slash operator manager that's looking to achieve similar results, because you're going to have common mind think in terms of, like, how we need to get things done, and you'll have a match on that. So for folks listening, we're talking about who to sell first to when you're when you're a scrappy startup. It's to find similar scrappy startups in property management or in ownership groups, because they're going to be able to match your speed to decision.
Right. And I say emerging
Yeah.
manager very intentionally, of like, you want a company that has a real estate firm that has aspirations to get really big,
Yeah.
but selling into generational owners is totally doable. I know a lot of people who have success doing that. It is its own challenge as well, separate from selling into a private equity group that has, 10 buildings under management, wants to get to 50 in the next 2 years. So those are
Mhm.
each their own kind of personas. So thinking hard about how you want to approach that is key if you've got any kind of product you're selling into real estate.
What are the typical objections that people offer up and to prop tech? Like, are you a way to articulate that? Is there a way to answer that question? Like, what people often hear?
Well, it obviously depends a lot on what you're
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out a
offering
way.
and
Yeah.
and what you're doing. So I would say, you know, the biggest barrier is just inertia. Like, there is a way they've always been doing it, and the first step is getting them to recognize there's a problem with how they're doing it today.
Mhm.
Because so many people look at it and say, we've done it this way for 30 years. We can keep doing it this way. Maybe we'll save a couple of bucks if
Mhm.
we do it this other way, but this works. It's fine. It's familiar. So getting them to kind of recognize a problem or
Mhm.
recognize an opportunity is really the most important. And it's just going to be at a high level the biggest objection people face. And one thing we do get into in the course is like some of the things that can happen a little further downstream. So we often see conflicts between, the buyers who are central and the actual
Mhm.
on the ground teams that have to implement and use this stuff. And it's the
Mhm.
number one reason why implementations and pilots go off the rails is the buyer is really excited, but then the people who are actually using it on site are like, oh, what is this? Another tool. The average person on site has 21 separate logins to various technology tools. So there's a lot of tech fatigue there. So you got to overcome that.
Yeah.
Doable, but it's tricky.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, and have that similar conversation is that we try and market to both people, and the things that we try to communicate on. And again, like I use the word try because we put the effort in, and it's inconclusive in how it's landing because you don't really get that feedback until you're in
Yeah.
battle. Um, but at least it helps us figure out a way to frame ourselves for the people that are on the ground, like the experts. And what we all often hear is that, they're often unenthusiastic about the change, but maybe with a perceived alternate. If we've got an excited buyer, and then we're cascading the change down to the users, and the users object because they're too busy, not right now, maybe later, kind of like the classic, let's just punt. Um, and then we'll offer an alternative to that and say, well, we can do the work for you. We can outsource it and get on. And then they get engaged right away because they're feeling a threat of having that work. This is going to happen with or without me. So I may as well
Right.
join in. And so while we offer often that we'll do the expert work, we deliver on it.
Yeah.
Because the maintenance team, they realize that this is going to happen with or without them.
Right.
And so they jump in.
Yeah.
And it can happen in the same conversation. So it is interesting because there is a bit of psychology there, and it's not intended to be a bluff, but it's like, well, we can solve this a different way if that's something that's interesting. If you are too busy, I acknowledge that and totally get that. We can do this way, and then maybe that'll save you some time. And they go, oh, I would rather do it ourselves.
Right. Absolutely.
You know,
They still want to own it.
they still want to own it. They're just kind of putting up blockers because they just don't want the change, because change is kind of like
Right.
annoying. When you're
Change
out
is
there
hard.
talking and coaching, change is hard. What's the one thing that people need to recognize in the sales cycle, as they're crafting a strategy, or they're thinking about their messaging, or having a sales call? If you could give one takeaway for people, to kind of like to mobilize around, with respect to finding and getting hell yes buyer, closing deals, what's the piece of advice you'd like to remind people about?
Empathize. Like, just empathize with the buyer, with the person on the other side of the conversation. Um, and there's multiple reasons for that. I mean, one, I think it will generate a better conversion rate, a better conversation. You'll learn more about the customer. But two,
Mhm.
it is the foundation for a better relationship. I mean, especially if you're selling a high value product, or like, it's a big industry, but it's a small industry in a lot of ways. Like,
Mhm.
starting with a sense of empathy and relationship building is such a good foundation for what you're doing as a salesperson, as a sales leader in the real estate industry today. So just starting the
Can you
conversations with empathy is really how I would do
can you
that. That's
can you give
first
an
and foremost
example of
about
that?
learning.
Yeah, it is.
About learning and
Can you give me an
understanding their
example of that?
problem. I mean, it's
Yeah.
not like, hearing their sob story and talking about that. It's
Mhm.
about, what are you facing? What are the problems you're facing at your job today? Understanding that and just coming at it with that perspective.
So then, and I think that for like, while we can understand the definition of empathy, like executing on empathy can be a challenge when we're excited about what we've got.
Yeah.
And so we end up talking about what we have to offer versus double clicking on what they're trying to solve.
Yeah.
And that comes off as, we may frame the problem that they maybe should have, but we're not actually asking them what the problem that they have.
Yep. Exactly.
Very cool. Empathy. I love it. I think that in fact, I was just redoing, just iterating on our sales deck a little bit. And one thing I did this time that was different is actually built it out, um, with like on a blank page with just the questions I want to ask in order to try and draw out the conversation, and avoid
I
me
like
from
that.
talking.
I like
Right.
that.
So instead of like this the narrative, right, of me talking, it was like, okay, what questions how am I going to build this deck, and what questions?
Yeah. I like that a lot.
Yeah. Who should we talk to next?
Sorry, I missed that.
Who should we talk to next?
Oh, people are great at sales.
Yeah.
Oh my
Yeah.
gosh. There's so many different types of like great salespeople and people who are going out there selling a product. I mean, you have someone who is, coming from a very, like, I should say, wonky perspective, like very data driven, someone like LD Salmonson at Cherry, super smart dude, built one of the best data companies in real estate today. You have someone like Roman Padan at Casa, done an incredible job getting short-term rentals into, a lot of landlords out there. Jason Fuden at Placemaker won over a lot of investors to build his operating platform. So there's a handful of names, people who are just three very, very different types of sales leaders, executives, founders at proptech companies.
Well, those are all three new names to me. So I'll reach out to them. I'll drop your name, see what comes up. Out of three, I should get one. You never know. That's the top of funnel.
They're good people.
How can people get a hold of you? What's the best way?
Yeah, you reach me at brad@thesisdriven.com, or on LinkedIn, Brad Hargreaves, or just check out our site, ThesisDriven.com, or courses.thesisdriven.com is where you can find all of our educational programs.
Very cool. And do you also have a data set that you're marketing?
Yeah, so it's a bit of a side project we've built over the past 2 years. We have the largest database of real estate developers and owners out there. It's a prospecting database for anyone selling into the real estate industry.
And would that be, comparative to CoStar, to ALN, those kind of things?
Yeah,
Just
so
people have a
it's a
frame.
little different than
Obviously,
CoStar
it's
and ALN.
better.
It is, CoStar is super expensive, first of all. We are $99 a month. They have site-specific information. Ours is not site-specific. It is just what developers are building in a given city, and then what are they building thematically? Who's doing ground-up multifamily? Who's doing office? Who's doing industrial, data centers? And then contact information. So we go deep on contact information, all the department leaders of each, with email, phone, LinkedIn. So it's great with prospecting oriented database, less focused on investors, brokers, et cetera.
Will we get a chance to kind of play with that in the course?
Yeah, so we talk about it a little bit in the course. So yeah, happy to chat more about that in the course.
Very cool. Awesome. All right. Well, thanks for listening. Thanks for today. Thanks for everyone for listening. This has been super insightful. I mean, the closing is the takeaway is empathy. Getting a hold of Brad is at ThesisDriven.com or the courses.ThesisDriven.com. Obviously, you want to reach out to me. I'm on LinkedIn. You're probably right one click from chatting with me at any given moment. Please follow or subscribe on Apple or Spotify. Add comments or ratings to the podcast. It's very helpful to help keep this thing going, and really help us get kind of more conversations. So like what Brad's doing with the selling into owners thing, we want to make sure people get different perspectives on how to sell into property management and real estate, and curate thousands of conversations around what people are doing that are successful. Anything else to add before we close off?
No, it's a great conversation. Thanks so much for having me on.
Right on. Appreciate it. Thanks for listening, everybody. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Take care. And we end. Awesome. That was good. Appreciate that.